Good morning. My name is Bill Carson. I'm with U.S. Bank Community Development Corporation, headquartered in St. Louis, Missouri. I'm also vice chair of the EcoDistricts Board of Directors, and I'm so thrilled that all of you could be here with us this morning, here in beautiful Denver, Colorado, for the EcoDistricts Summit. Ryan, thank you so much for your great thoughts on how infrastructure can be used to connect rather than disconnect. I think we've seen around the United States and around the world how infrastructure has been used oftentimes to disconnect people from opportunities at the same time that it creates opportunities. So it's fantastic to see something like this happening in Atlanta. I've had a chance to see that myself, and I encourage everyone, if you have not seen the Atlanta Beltline, definitely take a walk around, take a bike around, and certainly learn what this great piece of infrastructure is doing for the city of Atlanta. Unlike Atlanta, Denver is a relatively new city in the context of cities in the United States, but it's undergoing a massive transformation. I was surprised to learn the last time I was here in Denver from the Office of Economic Development that the city of Denver considers one of its biggest problems to be trying to figure out how to house the 2,500 millennials a month that are moving to this city, including two of my family members and my own son that recently moved here to the University of Denver. In fact, Denver has added 4,000 to 5,000 people a month to the metro area over the course of the last 2 years, and added about 100,000 people over the course of the last decade. So pretty remarkable growth that's happening. As this type of growth and transformation is happening, this influx of population, though, developers need to really think about the kinds of challenges that this type of population growth creates. Pressures on housing prices, pressures on infrastructure, pressures on housing, pressures on a number of different things. And we're really thrilled to have us joined today by 3 developers from the Denver area that really consider all of these types of things in their strategies for redeveloping various neighborhoods and creating various neighborhoods in the Denver area that are keeping up with that demand and doing it in a way that does it both sensitively for the environment, sensitively for the people that live here, and at the same time respecting and honoring the historic nature of the city of Denver. So I'm very glad to have sitting next to me Susan Powers, president of Urban Ventures, LLC, Kyle Zeppelin of Zeppelin Development, of course Ryan, and Chris Frampton of EastWest Partners today. So thank you very much, and please join me in welcoming them. So Chris, I'm going to start with you at the opposite end. So tell us a little bit about some of the developments that you have built here in Denver over time, and introduce a little bit more about EastWest, and talk about the ways that you're helping to keep up with the pressures and the influx of people from around the country that are coming not only around the U.S., around the globe, and into Denver, and considering that within your developments.
I could do that for an hour and a half.
You have 3 minutes.
Yeah, okay. So EastWest is my dad started the company about 30 years ago up in Vail, of all places. And interestingly enough, one of our senior partners, a guy named Mark Smith, wanted to move to Denver in the late 90s. And there was an opportunity to buy a piece of land in downtown Denver. As a resort developer, for those of you who have been, we essentially developed Beaver Creek. We were the master developer there. And Beaver Creek is a super luxury ski resort just down the road from Vail, and really a very nice place and quite beautiful. And so we had this really, I think at the time, I mean, it wasn't me. I wasn't in diapers, but I was in New York drinking a lot. And but what the company wanted to do, what my dad and Mark wanted to do, was in essence build an urban resort. What's amazing about resorts, and they're really kind of fascinating, people go from, and Kyle grew up in a ski resort too, and what's fascinating about resorts, particularly ski resorts, is that people travel from all around the world to have this 1 week, 2 week experience where they can walk everywhere, where they live on a grid, where they sit outside at cafes, and in essence, they sort of do it on vacation. They go to Paris for 6 months, and then they go back and live out on the perimeter. And so, what we really, our basic thesis in the late 90s was that people would want to live in these, in essence, what we called urban resorts. Today, we call that urban development. But at the time, we called it an urban resort. And I think it's really proven out to be true. It's very, very fortuitous that they thought about that, and we had a lot of luck. At EastWest, we've been really, really fortunate to have a series of amazing things conspire to make us successful. Almost everybody here in this room by now knows the story of our transit network here in Denver, 100 and some odd miles of bus rapid transit and light rail and heavy rail. And how many people rode the train in from the plane? Yeah, so cool. So when you got off at the station, did you have that experience of getting off and sort of looking around, trying to figure out where you're going? And then there's a bunch of people just moving really rapidly past you. Such a cool experience. My favorite part about going down to the train station is there's about 75% of the people know what they're doing, and 25% have no clue, which is what a train station's like. That's really a train station. So all those things sort of conspired in our favor, and we own the land right next to the train station, the majority of it. And in 2005 or so, ourselves and Continuum Partners were selected as the master developers of Union Station, the entire project, where we served in the role of financing that project, designing that project. For a while, we managed it. Got to work with an incredible group of people. It's awesome to be in Denver. We have this amazing ability to come together, much like the chart you put up on the Beltline. We have this great chart we can put up about Union Station, and what's neat about it is every single one of the 24 organizations that worked on building the train station can put themselves at the middle of the chart, which is really an accomplishment. So we've been working down there now for about 15 years. Interestingly enough, we're almost done. So there are, when we first started, there were roughly 75 acres of developable land between the Platte River and the train station. And this time, 2 years from now, all but one of those parcels will be developed. Something like 4.5 million square feet of stuff. So, fun place to be.
That's awesome. And Kyle, I'll turn to you now that the EcoDistrict Board had a chance yesterday to have a meeting at your and your dad's fantastic taxi development, which repurposes a lot of existing buildings into a fantastic live, work, retail, commercial district. Can you tell us more about that and how you've started to repurpose some infrastructure elements of Denver into new uses?
Sure. So I'm also a second generation developer. My dad started in 45 years ago or so in the Lodo district, mid-70s, different kind of opportunity around historic reuse, underappreciated neighborhood, and first generation of loft projects and cafes and some different kind of things than were otherwise happening. We moved on to a neighborhood called the Golden Triangle, which is where we are now, and did the first projects here. Again, this predate, I was in diapers. Within the last 15 to 20 years, we've focused on a new area, more wrong side of the tracks, neighborhood called Rhino. It's subsequently come to be known as Rhino, which is this former industrial, very underappreciated area, still very connected to downtown, connected through the river, within a mile of downtown. So we have 28 acres on the river, which is our home base, a project called Taxi. We're on our 9th or 10th building. We've tended to focus, we developed all the way through the recession during the height of the residential boom, residential condo boom, when I think Chris and his family did really well. We were focused on new economy office that was kind of an afterthought for the rest of the market. But it's really been focused on people. So looking around the market, just figuring out where there's unmet needs, where we can have a unique role. So different kind of workspace, really looking at things like natural light and landscape. We had some pretty funky building stock to work with. So we've reused all the former mid-century industrial type buildings. And then we've done a different kind of architectural vocabulary. There's a certain amount of creative freedom that you get in a wrong side of the tracks type neighborhood, like Rhino. We've also done a project within the last 2 or 3 years called The Source, which is a new generation market hall. The word has started to get out on those, but that project was really just along street called Brighton Boulevard that was really, in our minds, Main Street through Rhino, probably not something that was familiar to a lot of people in Denver. But there was a 1880s former foundry that we came across that had some great bones, but not a lot of life to it. There was auto shops and salvage yards on either side of it. So very kind of underused, but worked with 12 or 15 people, probably had a few hundred conversations with some artisan type tenants that were doing more interesting things throughout the region. So to have a real estate format that uniquely supported a flow of activity around these businesses where each of them worked better collectively than they did individually. Pretty time-honored idea, but somehow we got away from it. That project's been very well received, and based on the success of that project, we're doing a hotel and expanded market hall next door that's roughly monetarily 9 times bigger than the source was. So that's really become a signature type project for the neighborhood. And we're doing a new project around the new rail station, which includes a market hall and some different kind of workspace, taking advantage of that opportunity, which is the last stop before downtown.
It's awesome. And it's really fantastic. Again, if you get the opportunity to see the taxi development in other areas of Rhino District, it's really, really a fantastic development. Susan, I'll turn to you now.
Thank you.
We often talk about new economy and millennials in the growth of cities.
So thank you.
That wasn't my point.
Okay.
That was not my point. Okay. My point was that Urban Ventures and the ARIA Denver project seem to be really focusing on the forgotten families that oftentimes have trouble keeping up with the changes with gentrification, without pricing, and even with the types of units that families need to live in. To survive in a rapidly growing city. Can you tell us a little bit more about how your development practice has counteracted that?
Sure. Thank you. And I want to thank you so much for your presentation. I love the ending slide that said, you must act, time to act, because I think that needs to be the walkaway that we all have from this conference as well. The ARIA project is actually a former convent, so it's a very, I have my life split between a site that used to be a great manufacturer of illegal marijuana at one end of the city, and then I get to go and work in this very pristine convent environment. So it's a balancing act between them. But we've been involved for this, and I guess this is part of the story, is for 10 years now. This was a pre-recession start, then a little bit of a we had a state believers, and then got to pick it up in 2012 again. So it's 17 acres that we purchased from the Sisters of St. Francis, and this is a kind of a niche business, I think, for any women developers in the audience. Sisters like to deal with, the sisters like to deal with sisters. So they, I'm an honorary sister now, and they're wonderful women, and they wanted to find a developer that shared their values. And I didn't go to Catholic school. I don't share necessarily all the values, but we didn't want a Walmart. We had a lot in common. We didn't want to, we didn't want a gated community. And we sat down and had that conversation about what kind of community do we want to create that fulfills their values. They were still living. We built a little community for them on the corner, and they're still there. But so they watch over us, and they bury medals whenever we need good luck. So we've done that for financing. We've done that for all kinds of things. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. But in the process of this, we've built one of the principles is that we wanted to build a mixed income community very consciously, and that's what we're doing. So we have an apartment complex that's an affordable complex for folks that have incomes under 60% of the area median income. Where we have the original building that used to be a fruit tree orchard when the sisters purchased it. The original building they were in is a shelter for women and children coming out of homelessness as they're looking for a permanent home. And then we have townhomes that we built that were market rate that sold for up to $480,000. Right next to it, nobody walks around with a sign that says, "This is my income." It doesn't matter. And we've grounded it all in the center with a lot of urban agriculture, a lot of health focus in the community. We're renovating the convent building itself now for a co-housing community, which is kind of a Denmark model of living where people own their own space, but then they have a lot of shared space. So they have dinners together a couple nights a week. It's intergenerational. We have a wonderful couple that's pregnant, and we have a bunch of women that are in their 60s that want to move out of the houses they're in and share a life together as they age in place. So that's been a fascinating experience for me as a private developer, because all of us spend a lot of our time designing things for people who we never meet until they move in. This is a group that's been meeting for 2 years. We did the whole design process every Monday night for 6 months together. They had a lot of input. Sometimes I think I could kill myself for having started this process, but most of the time I look at it and say, these are the people. I mean, they should have an input. They should be part of the process of creating the space that they're going to live in, because this is their home. So I think we're experimenting a lot on this site with different ways of creating community with people of different ages and different backgrounds, and how do we do that in a way that is that's successful in their lives, and how do we then replicate this on other sites?
That's fantastic. As a person myself with young kids, how many of us in the room have school-age kids? Hands up. And how many of you, and keep your hands up, how many of you live in what you would consider to be the urban core? I saw a lot of hands sheepishly go down there. I'm curious, so this is your market here. So what are the types of things that you do, either in working with public, private, civic sponsorships and partnerships, or working with school systems and other types of things? What do you do? What are you doing to attract families and attract people to your community that have kids and want to stay in the urban core, despite the pressures of living with kids and unit sizes and public schools and other challenges like that? What are you doing in that regard?
We just completed a project called Freight Residence. It's 48 unit, mostly 2, 3, and 4 bedrooms. So it's a little bit goes counter to what's typical in the market, which is more millennial focused, especially for downtown. It's on the river in a neighborhood that probably just a few years ago was probably not likely that would be considered as a possibility for families. I live upstairs with a 3-year-old, 8-year-old, and it works. Just, there's the opportunities to have things be bikeable, walkable, have a built-in community. It's more of a turnkey situation where we don't spend our weekends working on our yard or fixing our boiler. So it's really, in a lot of ways, liberating, and I think, just throughout all of our projects, everything's personal, so just really projecting the things that matter throughout my life into the project. So we're working on a 300-unit affordable project that will be the biggest affordable project in the city, in an area that next to a bus terminal on the taxi site that, again, was probably pretty unthinkable for that type of density housing just a few years ago. So just a lot of opportunities to keep people in the core. I think there's, the city is a little bit rudderless right now. I mean, you guys might have an opinion as far as really
I was worried you wouldn't say anything, Kyle.
Attracting and retaining people in the urban core, close to downtown. There's not a lot of differentiation between which projects are likely candidates. So you have, typical affordable projects. Susan's is an exception, but it's basically worse quality finishes, worse design, and worse locations. I think what we're trying to do is use the opportunity to leverage.
That's not really true. We have the Denver Housing Authority here, who is a leader in creating affordable housing, and they get design awards.
Okay, so here's an example: is the Denver Housing Authority in ground zero for gentrification in 5 Points is selling their sites to market rate developers to build market rate projects, and there's plenty of market rate stuff going on. So I think that's an opportunity to slap a deed restriction on there, have a significant quantity of permanent deed restricted housing in the urban core that addresses a different area of the market. They're taking those dollars, moving them out to further outerlying places where there's existing concentrations of poor people and minorities, and you look at some of the challenges. You basically have unprecedented levels of economic segregation, where you have poor people and minorities concentrating in outerlying areas, and the city's filling back in with affluent white people. It's the role of developers, it's the role of the public sector to pick some spots to get outside that, to not leave the market to run its natural course, in my opinion.
I know we have at least one person in the room that might want to respond to that later in the conference, but we'll address that at another point. Chris, do you have any responses to that? Are your development practices reflecting the diversity of the Denver area, both socioeconomically and racially, and
No.
directly focused on that? That's fair.
No, they're not. I mean, Kyle touches on something that's true, and it's true everywhere. I actually think, there was this great article yesterday in the New York Times about the Beltway and we call it the Beltway? Beltline. And what I think is, I do think that there's an equitableness that has been lacking to date in urban cores, but I also think there's some economics at play. If you'll remember from Economics 101, when a new product, doesn't matter what it is, electric car, comes to market, that thing is more expensive. And then as that becomes more popular, and if it happens to work, becomes more appealing, then more people will enter that marketplace, and the function of the marketplace will take over and help to drive the cost of those things down. You can see it in clothing, you can see it in cars, and I don't think real estate is immune from that. So for the last 20 years, real estate's been, and it's really 20 years. I mean, I think there were certainly people doing it earlier than that, and you could sort of follow a thread of reurbanization, but the truth is it's about 2 decades old now. And so I think market forces that are at play. Now, what's fascinating, and you've touched on this so nicely today, is that infrastructure makes those choices on some level in real estate. We're unusual in that way. Well, maybe not. I mean, the infrastructure of roads and highways is the reason we can get clothes from China for 10 cents a shirt. So infrastructure makes those choices for us. And I think in Denver, and I honestly think this applies to cities everywhere, we've had this amazing sort of 20-year run driven by 2 demographic phenomena. One is baby boomers who want to get back downtown, and they don't even want to get back downtown. They want to get downtown for the first time. And then I think we've also had this phenomena, at least among wealthier groups, of delaying marriage and wanting to live downtown. And so where you live has been a lifestyle decision. But Kyle touches his group's working on this and making a difference on some small scale. But the biggest threat infrastructure-wise for me to cities and to this amazing momentum that we've had to this great lifestyle is that our schools and urban cores suck. And it's completely true in Denver, and it's completely true almost everywhere. And interestingly enough, I think there's been a real disconnect between planners and school districts. In Denver, our elected officials essentially have almost no control, or really even say, I don't want to exaggerate, but our schools operate separately. And so while the city's saying we're going to spend all this money on roads, we're going to spend all this money on stuff, schools are really disconnected from that. And we see it right here in Denver. I see it right with my team. I mean, we have this amazing ability to live pretty close to our city in really great walkable urban core neighborhoods, not the dead core stuff, but meaning central core stuff, but Wash Park and Lower Highlands and the Highlands and Bonnie Brae. These are all great, mid to, they become very expensive now, but mid to high sort of walkable neighborhoods. But at the same time, those families, as those houses get a little bit too small, say, look, you know what? My wife's going to have to be in the car. My husband's going to have to be in the car 25 minutes a day. My kids are going to have to be each way. So it's an hour. My kids are going to be going back and forth. You know what? Heck with it. I actually don't want that lifestyle of driving all around all the time with the kids. And quite frankly, I'd rather be closer to my school. And so in our case, I'm going north up 36 or I'm going south down 25, where the school districts are, Cherry Creek School District is one of the best in the country. And so people are making that choice to move and do that. And so for me, the real secret to the equity is the next step is in schools.
And I wouldn't disagree with some of that. I think that schools are definitely a challenge. That's not this panel, however. Maybe that's a different panel entirely. I would challenge your assumption that real estate is like the electric car, in that real estate is a finite resource, in that as people use that finite resource, the prices drive up, as opposed to when you buy the electric car, and as people use the finite resource, or the infinite resource, the prices drive down, and people get locked out of communities.
It's the problem with a metaphor. It only works until you investigate it further.
Until the softball moderator challenges your assumptions. So, Ryan, can you talk a little bit about Atlanta and how Atlanta is addressing some of these same types of challenges? Is the Beltline creating more pressure on disinvested communities, or is it alleviating some of the pressure?
It's creating a lot of pressure. Is this on? Can you hear me? It's creating a lot of pressure, but also opportunity. I think it's important to respond to what Chris was saying, that there's responsibility on the public sector side to better schools, better communities, better infrastructure, and all that. Private sector also has to provide the lifestyle for that, for people to live, and when we moved where we live now, which is in that what you would consider urban neighborhood in Atlanta, and we send our kids to public school, and the best in the region are public schools, Atlanta. Not all the Atlanta public schools, but the ones that we're in. The market, there was no market we couldn't find. We were architects willing to live in an unconventional kind of thing, but there was no space for us. There was nothing that we could afford in that area. So I think the private sector has to deliver, and I think all of this is about experimentation on both the side of the private sector. It's exciting to see you looking at different ways of doing things, micro units or co-housing or whatever. And the public sector has to innovate in creating the infrastructure for those lifestyles. And so, one of the things we're starting to look at in Atlanta is unlocking, we have a lot of rules against the kinds of things that you're talking about, smaller units that are too small or shared housing situations. So things that would reduce the cost of living, parking, for example, eliminating requirements for that. But I think we're catalyzing that change, and Atlanta's certainly not there yet. We obviously looking at traditional roles of subsidy and stuff, but realizing that the subsidies aren't going to solve the problem. The problem's too big. We can't afford to solve it. We have to find ways for the private sector to answer the problem, and that's changing the kind of products that we're building.
There's a development organization, in fact, one of our conference sponsors, Urban Strategies, about a decade ago produced a book that's a developer's toolkit for developers that are trying to engage schools in their community. Susan, how do you engage the schools near Aria and the other communities that you build, and how do you answer parents' questions about what to do about schools?
Right, and I think we probably should mention for people that are not local here that 2 years ago, I think it was, that downtown has its first elementary school that opened, and now announcing the middle school, in the next couple of years. And it's been interesting to watch there was a very conscious decision that they wanted to make sure that, it was done as a charter, but that there were folks from the neighborhoods there, that there were low-income kids that were going there. And as the years have gone on with people sending their kids there, it's gotten much more white and much more, upper middle class. And that's it's a concern because it's not achieving what some people thought it was supposed to do. So that's a constant. You have to be very conscious about that. That's a constant challenge, I think. In the neighborhood that Aria is in, we have what would be considered an underperforming elementary school. We've gotten very involved with them. We're fortunate to be across the street from Regis University, which is a Jesuit school, which is, Jesuits like to act. So they're out there doing stuff all the time, and they have their students in the school doing programming, and we've kind of embraced them, and we're trying our best to be supportive of them because gentrification is happening in the neighborhoods around us, and I think it's not a conversation that we're going to get through today, but it's what Kyle's touching on, and how do we keep the grain, keep the history, keep the culture of those neighborhoods as we're all investing in them, and we're having that kind of impact on them. And it's not an easy conversation. It's very uncomfortable. It talks about race, it talks about economics, about all kinds of social issues, but the best thing we can do is to keep talking about it because we're facing it in a lot of neighborhoods in Denver that the schools are changing, and some of that is helpful because you need to have the schools that are underachieving schools need to have families moving into them that will help with the attention on that school. But it's when the imbalance, when you cross that line where those families are being pushed out and it's suddenly a different school, then that doesn't feel comfortable either. So how do you address those issues? And I'm not sure that there's a solution yet, but there's a group called Revision in Denver who is involved a lot with urban agriculture, but they're also involved with trying to look at a model for a land banking model in the neighborhood for real estate, buying houses, having a nonprofit own them, and then letting people who's for generations their families that live there stay in that neighborhood. It's an expensive model, but but we have to do something.
I think this is just the start of the conversation that these types of challenges are happening in cities around the United States, and even in my own community, my own urban neighborhood is experiencing these same types of pressures. But we think that the EcoDistricts protocol is a good way to start addressing these types of challenges and starts to lay out a roadmap for doing things differently than the way that we've been doing things over the course of the last 75 years in the United States. So I want to take this opportunity to open up the last 10 minutes to questions from the audience. Softballs, hardballs, out of the box questions, absolutely everything is welcome. Please make sure that your question is actually a question. You've seen that person at the conference, haven't you? That reads you the entire book but doesn't actually ask a question. I will be the final judge as to what a question is. Sir, please ask your first question to the panel.
I do have a question.
Thank you. Will you please stand up and introduce yourself?
Yeah.
Say where you're from.
Paul Crane from Seattle, Washington.
Welcome, Paul.
And we are grappling with trying to place a urban school in downtown with our rapid growth downtown, South Lake Union. And my question's for the gentleman on the end who's, your RTA system here is incredible. I wish we could make this thing happen in Seattle that quickly, where it takes us with incremental financing. Anyway, the question I have for you, in your development around Union Station, did you consider placing an urban school there? You've got a great central location for a high school, middle school, to pull people into, kids in there too.
Yeah.
Have you considered that?
Yeah, when we started, when we first bought the land at Riverfront, we were required to build an urban school. When we had a site at 20th Street and Little Raven. And as we worked through it with DPS, really realized that the space that we had set aside was too small. And so in working with them, we actually, and Sue was involved in some level too, we went and did a land swap. There was a piece of land that the Denver Public Schools owned, and there was a piece of land that the city of Denver owned. And so we wrote a check that made up the difference between the appraisals. The piece of land that the city owned was worth more than the piece of land that Denver Public Schools owned. And so we did that. It's next to the Children's Museum in downtown Denver, and tried very hard to get an expeditionary school started. At the end of the day, there was difficulty for the public school system to raise the capital for that. It was a while ago, it was 10 years ago, because at the time there was a desperate need for capital investment all across the Denver public school system, and I think it was difficult to argue for building a brand new, gorgeous school for really a pretty small population. And so the transaction never happened. Ultimately, the expeditionary school became the charter school that Sue was talking about, and that is being placed in a neighborhood called Arapahoe Square, which is, about a mile from here. So we were required to do it. We tried to facilitate a different outcome, and unfortunately, the timing just didn't work out with the school system.
Next actual question. Right here, please.
My name's Amy. I'm from the Wild Foundation. We have a program called Wild Cities that seeks to rewild cities for a host of different reasons, but one is that as the planet urbanizes, the front lines of conservation are shifting to cities. And I'm wondering what it is, what are the current efforts that developments and cities have to kind of address biodiversity and to make cities more welcoming of the wild nature that enhances the well-being of people?
That's a great question. I'm going to ask that you give Amy the mic back, even though it's not a question. Can you tell us more about how you define rewilding cities? Are you going to be introducing, say, tigers to downtown Seattle?
Well, that's an interesting question, and I think the way we work is we let the solutions kind of percolate up from the bottom. But certainly there are some cities like Mumbai that have one of the largest natural national parks in it, and there are about 30 leopards in it. And so it depends on where your city is, but that in terms of biodiversity, big cats and big scary things might be a part of that. So.
Note to self, do not let children play alone in Mumbai's parks. Got it, okay. Anyone else like to address that?
Yeah.
Kyle, please.
We tend to think about some of the same issues, but urban's different, much more integrated approaches to urban stormwater is really a key to kind of going back to some of these more natural approaches. What's typical is pipes and detention. We have a river that's in bad shape. So there's clearly an opportunity not to just have the river end at its banks, but have tributaries run through city streets that create more bikeability, walkability. So that's clearly an opportunity. So I would just, that's one possibility. We're on the river in Rhino, and just kind of have a front row seat on some of the challenges there. And there's an opportunity to do a lot better.
Right, I've noticed that the Beltline is pretty wild for Atlanta. I mean, it's really fantastic. Has there been a lot of
as it urbanizes, though, well, that's the question. I think whether it remains that or not. I think when I talk about the Beltline catalyzing things, one thing that it's catalyzed is attention to the design of the built environment, including our relationship with nature. And one thing that Atlanta has going for it, we don't have the mountain ranges and the downtown riverfront, but we do have this amazing tree canopy. And so one of the projects that I've just been working on for the last 8 months takes that idea from the Beltline and applies it to the larger city. And so we're, in a year, I'll be able to answer your question because we're about to kick off the urban ecology framework, which looks at the natural condition of that part of the world, what's left of it, and then what range of opportunity there are and what strategic investments need to be made to protect and expand the wildness of the city. And where do we strike that balance between nature and urbanization so that we can have the best of both worlds? And how can we use nature as an infrastructure for greenways and stormwater and biodiversity and all of that? How do we provide access for kids to nature? And you can imagine all the sort of variations on that. So we're designing, it's part of a larger project called the Atlanta City Design, where we're designing what the city is going to be, and it's the technical, natural sort of input into that process, and output, really. So.
In my neighborhood, we had a fox, lived under a bush in the corner of the park, and all the kids knew not to play there, and darn fox got hit by a car, and so now we're having an absolute boom of bunnies.
What does a fox say? Ouch, maybe.
I don't know what to say after that. But I do think that the other end of the spectrum in my life is this industrial site that sits on the river, kind of the opposite end of downtown from where Kyle is, and it's basically the entrance to Sun Valley. So you'll be touring that. I'm sure later on hearing a lot about it, but the river. These are all industrial properties that turn their back on the river for all these years, and so reclaiming the river, making it part of the life of what we're redeveloping there, which is more of a commercial site and eventually having residential, it's an opportunity that we don't have very much in life. So I think we have hawks there, right? And it's still a gritty industrial site. This is a site that I'm sure, hopefully there is somebody from the Department of Environmental Health here, but I'll tell this story anyway. But when we bought this property, we did not realize until later on that it's still on a septic system, which is right next to the river, which is the buildings are all shut down, so there's nobody flushing toilets now. But think about the fact that the leach field is right next to the river, no sewer system connected to it. So, there are a lot of challenges there, but having the river there and the wildlife that comes with it, which is a big shock when you live in the city. I happen to be fortunate enough to have I live in a project that developed in partnership with EastWest, and we have 5 little babies living there now. By the way, you should know we have the first generation of kids that parents have decided to stay there, and they are the ones that are in their carriages, in the baby carriages, down by the river all the time. I mean, we're blocked from Union Station, and they find that water, and there's something about water and kids and families that go hand in hand, and I think we will all embrace that. I'd love to hear more about separately from you about what you do. Okay.
I think we have time for one, maybe 2 more questions. I'm going to take one from right here because the microphone is close to you, and that's the only reason. So please.
Thanks. Tamara Jones from Metro Atlanta. And I'm curious to hear, as developers, what you think are the most effective ways to talk to the developers who are not in the room, who are quick to take advantage of the kinds of infrastructure that we want to put in, but don't embrace the full set of principles that we have here when it comes to project selection, the process of working with communities, the principles of sustainability. So they take advantage, but often don't further the kind of vision that we want. So what's effective in talking to developers to get them to get on board?
Well, what's effective? I mean, we're kind of we live in the Wild West a little bit out here, where there aren't significant impact fees. The apartment boom is it's mostly market rate, mostly geared towards luxury. I was told that the construction defects isn't a problem for RAP insurance as long as you're above $400,000 for a sales price. Well, the city doesn't need that much more housing above $400,000. It needs housing significantly below that. So I think just having some laws in place that steer people in the right direction. I don't expect that the REIT-type developers that are doing same projects in San Antonio and Phoenix and Atlanta are going to come here left to their own devices and do great projects. I think we just need a regimen of rules and regulations to get people to be more responsible, and then be able to develop a culture around that where you have more people that are doing more interesting things.
I think I'd just like to add to that. I think that's important to see this as a sort of moving thing. I mean, cities like Atlanta and I believe like Denver too. I mean, they're shifting from an environment where the city had to incentivize developers to come there and give away lots of things and loosen regulations to spur on development, to a situation where everybody wants to be there and need to better frame those regulations to achieve better outcome and not give away everything and hold developers to a higher standard. But that's an evolution. I mean, that's not something that's going to happen overnight for lots of reasons. But I think a lot of cities, it's interesting to go around and see what different cities are doing. I think the most interesting ones are shaping that, and they're shaping it around projects like the ones you're doing.
You know, I would add, messing with the time here, but I think cities across the board also need to hold themselves to the same standards. So I think one of the interesting things is that while there is oftentimes a large discussion at the city level, particularly in circumstances like this, about building infrastructure for great awesomeness, the actual budgets speak differently, and the actual efforts speak differently. And so I think in Atlanta, God bless them, it's an amazing project. You started in what year?
2001.
Yeah, so we're 15 years later, and you have how many miles finished?
Not much.
Yeah. So I don't know if you remember
Thanks.
Stephen Shores from Pollock Shores, a great friend of mine. He's building 2 apartment buildings next door to your Beltline, and I asked him questions about it last night, and he said, well, I don't understand why our mayor just doesn't build the rest of the damn thing.
Yeah.
And
Well, we have a transit referendum in the fall, which
there you go.
we will.
So, I mean, I think, you know, cities have to it really urban development, but all development is a partnership between the private sector and the public sector. Whether you set out and say we're going to have a PPP or not,
Right.
you have one just implicit in the way that our government and our land development works.
Well, these challenges didn't start overnight, and they're not going to be resolved overnight. But I think for a first session on a, Tuesday morning. This is a great start, so I really want to thank all of our panelists, Chris, Kyle, Susan, and especially our keynote, Ryan, for sharing your wisdom and thoughts with us this morning. Thank you so much. Thank you. Wait, I need my mic back. You don't play music until I say you can play music. Okay. All right. So before I release everyone to a break, a couple of housekeeping things. We have about a 30-minute break, right now. Please be productive with that break. Go and visit the exhibit hall, especially the US Bank table, where we have a lot of great giveaways. Please use that to engage with some of your many other fellow conference attendees here. There are a lot of really interesting people in the room. I've taken a look at all of the backgrounds and titles and everything else. People from all around the country, a couple from Canada and outside the United States. Please go and engage, meet people, introduce yourselves to each other. I'd like just for a moment for all of my fellow EcoDistricts board members to take a stand and raise your hand just for a moment. If you're in the room, will you please? This is a fantastic and insightful group of leaders in areas of social justice and real estate development, in urban planning and public policy, et cetera. Please engage with them as well. We have an exciting vision for what EcoDistricts and what the EcoDistricts protocol is going to be, and we want all of your thoughts and ideas as to what that is, and we want to understand what it is that appeals to you about the EcoDistricts protocol and why you came here today to Denver to join us in this conversation. So. There was one other thing I was supposed to tell you. That's right. And Ryan Gravel will be signing his book in the center hallway.
Right over
Please
there.
pick up a copy, support the type of vision that Ryan is supporting, and spread the news of what he's done to support the redevelopment of Atlanta's infrastructure and how that can help your cities around the country. So again, thank you for being here this morning. Great way to kick off the EcoDistrict Summit. I look forward to meeting and talking with all of you. Come and say hi as well and comment on my awesome socks, which I'm sure you noticed. Thank you.